The wing broke at 4,000 feet. The bolt that broke it was 6 feet of ironwood tipped with metal forged in the Ashen Mountains, fired from a ballista that should not have existed, by men who should not have known where the Emperor would be flying that night. It entered below the left shoulder joint, where the great flight muscles anchor to bone, and it did what ashen metal does to dragons. It kept burning after it hit. The dragon did not fall. That is the first thing you need to understand about the 11 miles. A creature the size of a warship took a wound that would have dropped a lesser dragon out of the sky like a stone, and it did not fall. It descended. There is a difference, and the difference is will. Below him, the Empire scrolled past in the dark. The dragon knew every light. There, to the east, the Jade Palace, his own walls, his own guards, his own physicians sworn to his service. He turned away from it. There, along the river, 3 garrison forts, each with signal fires and dragon grounds, and men who would have emptied the armory to defend him. He passed over all 3. There, in the foothills, the healing temple at Doran's Cross, where the sisters kept dragon salve in jars the size of barrels for wounds exactly like this one. He passed it. Losing height the whole time, the broken wing folded against his side like a snapped mast. Flying on one wing in fury, the Emperor of everything below him passed every place that existed to receive him. Because here is the thing the men with the ballista could not have known. A dragon in mortal danger does not fly toward power. It flies toward safety, and those are not the same place. The palace had physicians, and the palace was where someone had learned his flight path well enough to put a ballista under it. The garrisons had soldiers, and soldiers talk, and somewhere between the garrisons and the council chamber was a mouth that had sold his sky to his enemies. Power was compromised. Power is always compromised. So the dragon reached for the one memory that smelled like safety, and it was 11 miles away, up where the pines thin out and the mountain turns to bare granite, and it was a door. He did not make the last 2 miles in the air. He made them on the ground, in the dark, dragging a wing that screamed against the frozen scree, leaving a furrow in the mountainside that hunters would find in the spring and never explain. He climbed with 3 legs and his chin, and the stubbornness that had kept his family on the throne for 900 years. I want to be honest with you about what he was by the time he reached the hut. He was not majestic. He was a dying animal at the end of his strength, and the last thing he saw before the dark took him was a thin line of firelight under a wooden door. He put his head against that door, and he stopped. Senna Voss heard the mountain go quiet. Not silence. Mountains are never silent. She heard the specific quiet of every living thing in a 5-mile radius, deciding at the same moment to stop making noise, which is a sound of its own if you have lived alone high enough for long enough. And Senna had. 3 winters alone since Tommen died, long enough to know the mountain's moods like a second marriage. She was at her table when it happened, and her hands did not stop working, because her hands were holding a hawk's wing and the wing was half set. You should see what I see when I look at this woman, because the dragon outside her door had seen it once already, 2 years before, and it is the reason he was outside her door and not bleeding out on a palace floor surrounded by men he could not trust. 31 years old, knuckles scarred by beaks and talons. A kitchen that was half apothecary. Rows of jars, willow bark and comfrey and wound moss, hanging bundles of yarrow gone papery in the roof beams. On her table, splints in 8 sizes, none of them made for anything human. Senna Voss set wings. Hawks that fishermen brought up from the valley with fouled feathers. Owls stunned by wires. Once, an eagle so big the farmer who carried it up the mountain wept with fear the whole way, and she had taken it out of his arms like a loaf of bread. Tommen had been the one who started it. Years ago. A broken-winged kestrel in a barley field. But Tommen had been gone 3 winters, taken by the same rock slide that took half the north pasture, and Senna had kept setting wings, because grief needs work to carry it, and because up here, the only things that knocked on her door were things that could not knock. The fire popped. The hawk on the table made its thin, furious sound. "Hold still," Senna said. "You are not the worst thing that has happened to me this week." Then the door shook. Once. A single blow, enormous and soft at the same time, like a mountain leaning its forehead against her house. and every jar on every shelf chimed together, and the hawk went rigid under her hands. Senna Voss sat still for the space of 3 breaths. Then she tied off the splint, set the hawk in its box, took the lamp, and opened the door. There are things the mind refuses at first delivery. The lamp showed her scales, and her mind said serpent, and then the lamp showed her more scales, and more, going up and out and back past the reach of any light she owned, and her mind stopped offering suggestions. A dragon lay against her doorstep with its head on her threshold stone. Not a dragon as the valley people drew them on tavern signs. Fat lizards with bat wings. This was the real thing, the thing that shakes the air over the capital on coronation days, black as a hole in the night, one wing folded right and one wing wrong. Very wrong. Even by lamplight, even knowing nothing, Senna could read that wing the way you can read a sentence with the words in the wrong order. The long bone between shoulder and wrist had a bend where no joint lived. The dragon's eye was open. The eye was the size of a dinner plate, and the color of molten copper cooling, and it was looking at her. I have sat 600 nights with dying creatures, Senna thought, and every one of them looks at you like this at the end. Not asking, past asking, just watching to see what you are. She was one woman with a lamp, 5 feet and some inches of widow in a wool shawl, and the thing on her doorstep could have swallowed her the way a trout takes a fly. What she felt was not courage exactly. It was the same thing that moved her hands to the hawk. Something is broken, and it has come to me, and there is no one else on this mountain. She set down the lamp on the threshold stone, 8 inches from teeth the length of her forearm. "All right," she said, in the voice she used on the eagles, low and bored on purpose. "Let me see the wing." The copper eye watched her walk the length of its body, and when her hands came to rest on the burning joint, gentle as snow landing, the dragon that had passed a palace, 3 garrisons, and a temple to reach this door, made a sound no living person had ever heard it make. It exhaled. Everything in it let go at once, the way a rope lets go when the load is finally set down. The eye closed. The emperor of the 9 provinces went under, on her doorstep, in the dark, safe. Here is a problem no book of healing has ever addressed. How does one woman set a broken wing when the wing weighs more than her house? Senna spent the first hour just learning the truth of it. The bolt had to come out. That was certain. She had seen char wounds before. A logger with an infected axe cut. And this was that horror at 50 times the scale, spreading while she watched. The wing bone had to be drawn straight and held. And the creature it was attached to could not be moved by anything smaller than a road crew. So the work would happen here, in the frozen yard, in the wind. She went through her stores like a general counting soldiers. Wound moss, all of it. 4 winters of gathering. Comfrey, boiled to paste in her biggest kettle. Every strip of linen in the house, and when those ran out, her own bed sheets, and when those ran out, Toman's shirts from the cedar chest, which she took out one at a time and did not let herself think about. The splint defeated her, until she looked up. Then she climbed into her own roof and cut free the spare ridge beam, seasoned pine, 11 feet, straight as a sermon, and dragged it down through the snow. And if you had stood in that yard at midnight you would have seen something worth telling your grandchildren. A widow in a dead man's coat, hauling a roof beam through the dark, past the sleeping head of a dragon, muttering the whole time in the tone of a woman who considers all of this a personal inconvenience. The bolt came out at dawn. She did it with rope, a lever, and geometry, braced against the stone trough, and when the ironwood shaft finally tore free of the joint the dragon woke screaming, and the scream started an avalanche 2 ridgelines away, and Senna Voss stood her ground in the falling snow dust, with her hands raised and said, "Done, done. It is out. It is out." And the copper eye found her, and held her, and believed her. She packed the crater of the wound with every scrap of moss she owned. She drew the bone as straight as winch and rope could draw it, splinted it with her roof beam and Toman's shirts, and finished a little after noon, having not slept, having not eaten, having spent the whole of her medicine and most of her linen and some part of her grief. The dragon watched her work. It did not snap, and it did not pull away. Creatures at the end of themselves know the difference between hands, and these hands it had chosen on purpose. There was a moment, near the end of that first day, that Senna carried with her afterward, the way you carry a stone in your pocket without knowing why. She had been binding the last of the splint, standing between the wing and the great wall of his ribs, close enough to feel the furnace heat coming off the scales, and exhaustion finally caught her mid-knot. Her knees went. Not a faint, just a stumble. 3 winters of alone and 30 hours of awake arriving all at once, and before her hand could find the trough to catch herself, something caught her first. The wing, the broken one. He had moved it, the wing she had just splinted, the wing that must have cost him a white sheet of pain to move at all. He had turned it 3 inches, so that her shoulder met the warm leading edge of it, instead of the frozen granite. Senna stood very still against the wing of a dragon, and the dragon held very still under the weight of a woman, and neither of them acknowledged it, and after a moment she finished the knot. "Do not do that again," she said. "You will undo my work." But that night she brought her blankets out to the woodshed and slept in the straw within reach of him, and told herself it was to watch the wound, and the dragon, who could hear her heartbeat from 40 feet, and knew exactly when she fell asleep, kept his own breathing slow and even underneath it, all night, like a hand kept steady under something balanced. On the 3rd day, the soldiers came. 6 riders, Imperial green, laboring up the drove road on horses that did not want to come. Senna saw them from a mile off, and something older than thought made her walk out to meet them at the pasture wall, away from the hut, away from the yard, away from the enormous silence, lying folded behind her woodshed, under a canvas of pine boughs she had cut and stacked over the worst of it. She would not examine, until later, why she had hidden him. She only knew that something with wings had passed over every soldier in the Empire to avoid them, and until she knew why, her yard was her own business. The sergeant was polite. "They were looking for a beast," he said. "A large beast, wounded, seen falling toward these mountains 4 nights past. There was a reward. There was also," he said, watching her face, "a punishment for concealment. But surely that would not concern an honest woman." "I heard something come down in the night," Senna said, which was true. Rocks fell 2 ridges east, which was also true, and her level look while saying it was the same look she gave the eagles, and it worked on sergeants too. They watered their horses at her trough. One of them, a boy no older than 20, stared at the trough's rim, where a groove the width of a wine barrel had been pressed into the granite as if by an enormous chin, and Senna said, "Ice does strange work up here," and the boy nodded, because it was easier. She watched them until the trees took them. Then she walked back to the woodshed, pulled aside a pine bough, and found the copper eye already open, already on her. "You are hiding from your own soldiers," she said. "That is one of 2 things. Either you are a criminal, or someone in that uniform is." The eye watched her. "I set wings," she said. "I don't ask them their politics first." But that night she cleaned Toman's old boar spear, and set it by the door, and the dragon heard the sound of the whetstone through the wall, and understood it was not meant against him, and slept. I will tell you this plainly, better than he had slept in 9 years. Now I will tell you what Senna could not know, and what changes everything you have watched so far. 2 years before the ballista, the Emperor Kaelen flew the mountains at night. He did it the way other rulers walk locked gardens. It was the only privacy the throne had left him. Below a certain altitude, the wind carries everything up. Wood smoke, voices, the whole confession of the ground. And on one of those nights, over one bare shoulder of granite, he passed low over a lamplit yard and saw a woman kneeling in the snow over a dying hawk. The hawk was past saving. He could smell that from the air. Death being a smell dragons know, the way millers know flour. The woman surely knew it too, because she was a woman who set wings, and this wing was not settable. The bird was finished, and no audience watched, and no reward waited, and it was bitterly cold. She stayed anyway. That was all. That is the entire event. She crouched in the snow for the better part of an hour, so that a hawk would not die alone on the ice, and she kept one finger on its breast the whole time, so the last thing it felt going out was warmth. Then she buried it, with the ground frozen, which cost her another hour, and went inside. The dragon circled twice and flew home, And the emperor woke the next morning in a palace where every kindness had a price tag, every hand that touched him wanted something, and every physician who bowed to him would have sold his flight path for the right sum, as one of them eventually did. He never spoke to anyone about the yard, but dragons file memories by scent, and that yard smelled like the one thing his empire could not manufacture, and 2 years later, falling out of the sky with ashen fire in his wing and treachery behind him, the animal in him did not debate. 11 miles. Past the palace, past the garrisons, past the temple. There, said the animal, the woman who stays. The wing healed the way mountains heal, slowly and on its own calendar, and the two of them settled into something neither had a word for. She talked to him. It began as the professional patter she gave the hawks and became, over the weeks, something else. She told him about the rock slide, about Toman, who used to sing off-key on purpose because it made her laugh, and how the silence after him had a texture, and how work was the only thing that held its shape inside it. She told him things she had told no living person, precisely because he was not a person, and the dragon lay in her yard with his chin in the granite groove he had pressed into her trough, and listened with an attention no one in 9 provinces would have believed the emperor possessed. He earned his keep as he mended. She woke one morning to find the winter's deadfall along her pasture wall, crushed into stove lengths, a season of firewood, snapped like kindling by something that had done it in the night with one foreleg. Another morning, the wolf tracks that had circled her sheep pen for years simply stopped appearing, and never appeared again. The hawks were the strangest part, and I want you to picture this, because no court painter will ever be allowed to. The farmers kept bringing birds up the mountain all winter. They did not know about her other patient. The yard was screened by the shed and the pine boughs, and so all that season, broken hawks convalesced in wooden boxes not 30 feet from the largest predator on the continent. By rights, they should have beaten themselves to pieces against the slats in terror. Instead, within a day or two, each one went calm. Uncannily calm. Senna noticed it, and could not explain it, and finally one evening she carried a box out to the woodshed, set it on a stump where the copper eye could see it, and said, "Whatever you are saying to them, keep saying it." The eye came around slowly, with the particular dignity of a creature deciding whether to admit something. "You are telling them there is nothing on this mountain allowed to hurt them," she said. "That is what you are doing. That is what you have decided your job is." The dragon looked at her for a long time. Then the copper eye closed, in the manner of an emperor declining to comment, and Senna Voss went back inside laughing quietly, and stopped on the threshold, struck square by the realization of how long it had been since she had heard that sound out of her own chest, in this house, with the door open to the cold. And once, in the 8th week, she stood on the pasture wall in a wind that smelled of thaw, and said, half to herself, "The bone is knitting. You will fly by the first melt," and heard her own voice go flat on the last word, and was honest enough, in the privacy of her own skull, to know why. The copper eye came around to her, and the look in it was so exactly the look of a man about to say something that she laughed and turned away. "Do not flatter yourself," she said. "I say the same to the hawks." She did not say the same to the hawks. The wing opened on the first true day of spring, and it was like watching a cathedral unfold. Senna stood in the yard while 40 feet of mended flight rose off her handiwork, roof beam and all, the splint dropping away into the mud, and the dragon turned into the wind, and spread the whole dark map of himself against the sky, and held it, and the joint held, and the long bone held, and everything she had built out of moss and geometry and a dead man's shirts held. He beat the wing once, and the yard went white with driven snow. And then, instead of rising, he folded it. He came back down. He lowered the great head until the copper eye was level with her whole body, and he looked at her for a long moment, and Senna Voss, who was no fool, and who had spent a winter noticing that her patient understood grammar, said quietly, "You have somewhere to be. Whoever aimed at you is still out there aiming. Go on." The dragon did not go on. The dragon stepped back into the middle of her yard, and the air bent, and the light did something the eye refuses to keep, and where 400 tons of night-colored patience had stood, there was a man. He was tall, and he was scarred along the left shoulder in a way she knew intimately, having packed that scar with moss for a season, and he wore plain travel clothes with no crown anywhere on him, and Senna knew him anyway, because every coin in her purse had his face on it. "You asked me once," the Emperor Kaelen said, and his voice was hoarse with a winter of disuse, "whether I was a criminal, or whether my soldiers were. It was the second. My chancellor bought a ballista and sold my sky. I have known since the night it hit me. I have spent the winter deciding what to do about it." "And what will you do?" "Justice," he said, loudly. And then, and here the emperor of the 9 provinces, who had faced down councils and armies, looked at a widow's doorstep as if it outranked him. "Then I would like to come back, if the door opens." He came back in the summer, not with a retinue. That happened once. In the first week after his return, a column of Imperial green had started up the drove road, and word of it reached the mountain ahead of the horses. And when the herald finally stood in her yard reading a proclamation of Imperial gratitude, Senna listened with her arms folded and said, "Tell him the hawks did not send a herald either." And the column went back down the mountain, and in the capital, when the message was delivered word for word, the emperor laughed for the first time in public in 9 years, and the council did not understand, and he did not explain. So he came back the other way. On the wing, at dusk, landing in the high pasture like a secret, shifting at her wall, knocking at her door like a man, she fed him valley cheese and last autumn's cider. He split wood, badly, with human arms, and she mocked the blisters, and he let her, which his counsel would not have believed possible, and neither, by then, did he. He asked her once, over the cider, why she had hidden him from the riders that third morning, before she knew anything, when the reward would have rebuilt her whole north pasture. Senna thought about it properly, because it deserved a proper answer. "The hawks that come to me have usually just escaped something," she said at last. "You had the same look. I have never once handed a hawk back to the thing it escaped from." The emperor set down his cup and did not speak for a while, and she let him not speak, which was its own kind of answer between them by then. There is a schoolmaster in the valley who owns a shelf of books from over the sea, and one of them says a thing Senna had copied out years ago and pinned over her workbench, back when the rock slide was new and the house was silent. The emperor found it there one evening, a scrap of paper gone soft with age, and read it, and stood very still. Ernest Hemingway wrote, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places." "That is the business of this house," Senna said from the doorway. "Broken places, you may have noticed. The chancellor was tried in the autumn. What the trial made famous was a detail from the emperor's own testimony, that on the night of the ambush, wounded past saving, he had passed over every stronghold of his own power to reach a place his enemies could never have found on any map, because it appeared on no map of power at all. He would not name the place. The court poets went mad inventing it. None of them invented a woodshed. You want to know how it ends, and I will tell you, but you already know, because you watched it happen the whole way through. It did not happen in the yard in spring, or at the door in summer. It happened in the dark of the first night, when a dying animal chose an 11-mile agony over every throne-sworn healer in the empire, because it had once watched a stranger keep her finger on a dying hawk so the going out would be warm. She married him in the Valley Chapel, in the spring of the following year, in front of 11 witnesses and no poets. The empire got its empress the way the mountain gets its weather, without being consulted, and survived it just as well. She kept the hut. Emperors have summer palaces. This empress had a stone room full of splints, and every year when the first snow closed the passes, the court knew better than to schedule anything at all, because the imperial couple was elsewhere, up where the pines thin out, in a house with a mended roof beam, and the empress was setting wings, and the emperor, this is true, the servants who winter up there will swear to it, the emperor holds the birds. The scar on the wing never faded. In dragon form it shows as a pale seam along the left wing's long bone, and the flight masters will tell you that wing is now the stronger of the two, that the mended bone carries more than the whole one, and if you ask them how that can be, they shrug and say it is a known thing. It is simply how the beast heals. The world breaks everyone. Afterward, some are strong at the broken places, and some, if they are very stubborn and very lucky, and have dragged themselves 11 miles in the dark toward a thin line of firelight. Some are strong precisely there, at the exact point of the break, where a widow on a mountain packed the wound with everything she had left, and held it straight, and it held. It held.